Hello and welcome to Talking Tolkien. In this, chapter 3 of Frodo's journey, we'll be following the four hobbits and their new companion, the mysterious Strider, on their journey out of the village of Bree. After an eventful night at the Prancing Pony, they woke up on the morning of September 30th to the dreadful news that their ponies had bolted from the stables and could not be found. After some trouble, a pony was bought from one of the locals and the small party finally departed, much later than they had intended. After their breakfast, the hobbits had to repack and get together further supplies for the longer journey they were now expecting. It was close on 10 o'clock before they at last got off. By that time the whole of Bree was buzzing with excitement. Frodo's vanishing trick, the appearance of the Black Horseman, the robbing of the stables, and not least the news that Strider the Ranger had joined the mysterious hobbits, made such a tale as would last for many uneventful years. Most of the inhabitants of Bree and Staddle, and many even from Coombe and Archet, were crowded in the road to see the travellers start. The other guests in the inn were at the doors or hanging out of the windows. Strider had changed his mind and had decided to leave Bree by the main road. Any attempt to set off across country at once would only make matters worse. Half the inhabitants would follow them to see what they were up to and to prevent them from trespassing. They tramped off, anxious and downhearted, under the eyes of the crowd. Not all the faces were friendly, nor all the words that were shouted, but Strider seemed to be held in awe by most of the Breelanders, and those that he stared at shut their mouths and drew away. He walked in front with Frodo, next came Merry and Pippin, and last came Sam leading the pony, which was laden with as much of their baggage as they had the heart to give it, but already it looked less dejected, as if it approved of the change in its fortunes. At last they left the village behind. The escort of children and stragglers that had followed them got tired and turned back at the south gate. Passing through, they kept on along the road for some miles. It bent to the left, curving back into its eastward line as it rounded the feet of Bree Hill, and then it began to run swiftly downwards into wooded country. To their left they could see some of the houses and hobbit holes of Staddle, on the gentler southeastern slopes of the hill. Down in a deep hollow away north of the road there were wisps of rising smoke that showed where Coombe lay. Archet was hidden in the trees beyond. However, in the meanwhile, walking was not unpleasant. Indeed, if it had not been for the disturbing events of the night before, they would have enjoyed this part of the journey better than any up to that time. The sun was shining clear, but not too hot. The woods in the valley were still leafy and full of colour, and seemed peaceful and wholesome. Strider guided them confidently among the many crossing paths, although left to themselves they would have been at a loss. He was taking a wandering course with many turns and doublings to put off any pursuit. Whether because of Strider's skill or for some other reason, they saw no sign and heard no sound of any living thing all that day, neither two-footed except birds, nor four-footed except one fox and a few squirrels. Something worth noting is that in The Lord of the Rings they spend 2.5 days wandering around Chetwood, going back on themselves trying to lose the trail. Also, the Chetwood's a lot bigger than it is in the representation in the Lord of the Rings online game I'm using here. So that's the reason that this next couple of days are quite short. In reality, they spent a lot longer here than it seems. All the book mentions about the next day is this. The next day they began to steer a steady course eastwards, and still all was quiet and peaceful. And so after a long but not unpleasant walk through the Chetwood, they rested on the eastern edges of the wood, and if you look into the distance there they could see Weathertop still many miles ahead. And then finally, just to catch up on the maps, we can see here this is the map that continues on from chapter 2, where the green line ended in Bree. So the next day they travelled down out of Bree into the Chetwood, where they wandered around a little bit to try and lose the trail. And then we can see on the final day that's just gone, that short pink line, even though it doesn't look very far, it's all to do with scale that I mentioned before. So actually the Chetwood's a lot larger than it looks there, so it was a lot further that they walked on the latest day. So then they camped here on the edge of the Chetwood. On the third day out from Bree, they came out of the Chetwood. The land had been falling steadily ever since they turned aside from the road, and they now entered a wide, flat expanse of country, much more difficult to manage. They were far beyond the borders of the Bree land, out in the pathless wilderness, and drawing near to the Midgewater Marshes. The ground now became damp and in places boggy, and here and there they came upon pools and wide stretches of reeds and rushes filled with the warbling of little hidden birds. They had to pick their way carefully to keep both dry-footed and on their proper course. At first they made fair progress, but as they went on, their passage became slower and more dangerous. The marshes were bewildering and treacherous, and there was no permanent trail, even for rangers, to find through their shifting quagmires. The flies began to torment them, and the air was full of clouds of tiny midges that crept up their sleeves and breeches and into their hair. They spent a miserable day in this lonely and unpleasant country. Their camping place was damp, cold, and uncomfortable, and the biting insects would not let them sleep. There were also abominable creatures haunting the reeds and tussocks that from the sound of them were evil relatives of the cricket. There were thousands of them, and they squeaked all round, neek breek breek neek, unceasing all the night until the hobbits were nearly frantic. The next day, the 4th, was little better, and the night almost as comfortless. Though the Neeka-breekers, as Sam called them, had been left behind, the midges still pursued them. As Frodo lay, tired but unable to close his eyes, it seemed to him that far away there came a light in the eastern sky. It flashed and faded many times. It was not the dawn, for that was still some hours off. So again, here's a quick look at the map of Breeland. We can see here the last 2 days have been added as they progress through the Midgewater Marshes. Even though again it doesn't look far on this map, each of the last 3 days they've covered about 15-16 miles a day, so still making good progress as they head towards the Weather Hills. They had not gone far on the 5th day when they left the last straggling pools and reed beds of the marshes behind them. The land before them began steadily to rise again. Away in the distance eastward they could now see a line of hills. The highest of them was at the right of the line and a little separated from the others. It had a conical top, slightly flattened at the summit. "That is Weathertop," said Strider. "The old road, which we have left far away on our right, runs to the south of it and passes not far from its foot. We might reach it by noon tomorrow if we go straight towards it. I suppose we'd better do so." All that day they plodded along, until the cold and early evening came down. The land became drier and more barren, but mists and vapours lay behind them on the marshes. A few melancholy birds were piping and wailing, until the round red sun sank slowly into the western shadows, then an empty silence fell. The hobbits thought of the soft light of sunset glancing through the cheerful windows of Bag End, far away. At the day's end they came to a stream that wandered down from the hills to lose itself in the stagnant marshland, and they went up along its banks while the light lasted. It was already night when at last they halted and made their camp under some stunted alder trees by the shores of the stream. And here we can see the route in pink that Frodo and the others took on October the 4th, which was their last day spent in Breeland. So here we can see our last look at the Breeland map, where they've moved all the way from Buckland, staying at Crick Hollow, all the way now into the Weather Hills, where they'll move into the Lone Lands. Next morning they set out again soon after sunrise. There was a frost in the air, and the sky was a pale, clear blue. The hobbits felt refreshed, as if they'd had a night of unbroken sleep. Already they were getting used to much walking on short commons, shorter at any rate than what in the Shire they would have thought barely enough to keep them on their legs. Pippin declared that Frodo was looking twice the hobbit that he had been. The hills drew nearer. They made an undulating ridge, often rising almost to 1,000 feet, and here and there falling again to low clefts or passes leading into the eastern land beyond. Along the crest of the ridge, the hobbits could see what looked to be the remains of the green-grown walls and dikes, and in the clefts there stood the ruins of old works of stone. Strider tells the hobbits about Amon Sul, also known as Weathertop, and how Elendil once stood there looking for Gil-galad to come out of the west in the days of the last alliance. When Merry asks Strider who Gil-galad was, this song is murmured by Sam, who heard it from Bilbo.
Gil-galad was an elven king, of him the harpers sadly sing. The last whose realm was fair and free between the mountains and the sea. His sword was long, his lance was keen, his shining helm afar was seen. The countless stars of heaven's field were mirrored in his silver sheen. But long ago he rode away, and where he dwelleth none can say. For into darkness fell his star in Mordor, where the shadows are.
By night they had reached the feet of the westward slopes, and there they camped. It was the night of the 5th of October, and they were 6 days out from Bree. In the morning they found, for the first time since they had left the Chetwood, a track plain to see. They turned right and followed it southwards. It ran cunningly, taking a line that seemed chosen so as to keep as much hidden as possible from the view, both of the hilltops above and of the flats to the west. It dived into dells and hugged steep banks, and where it passed over flatter and more open ground on either side of it, there were lines of large boulders and hewn stones that screened the travellers almost like a hedge. It was already midday when they drew near the southern end of the path, and saw before them, in the pale clear light of the October sun, a grey-green bank leading up like a bridge to the northward slope of the hill. They decided to make for the top at once, while the daylight was broad. Concealment was no longer possible, and they could only hope that no enemy or spy was observing them. Nothing was to be seen moving on the hill. If Gandalf was anywhere about, there was no sign of him. On the top they found, as Strider had said, a wide ring of ancient stonework, now crumbling or covered with age-long grass. But in the centre a cairn of broken stones had been piled. They were blackened as if with fire. About them the turf was burned to the roots, and all within the ring the grass was scorched and shriveled, as if flames had swept the hilltop, but there was no sign of any living thing. Standing upon the rim of the ruined circle, they saw all round below them a wide prospect, for the most part of lands empty and featureless, except for patches of woodland away to the south, beyond which they caught here and there the glint of distant water. Beneath them, on this southern side, there ran like a ribbon the old road, coming out of the west and winding up and down until it faded behind a ridge of dark land to the east. Nothing was moving on it. Following its line eastward with their eyes, they saw the mountains. The nearer foothills were brown and sombre. Behind them stood taller shapes of grey, and behind those again were high white peaks, glimmering above the clouds. Frodo also discovered some scratches on a flat underside of a rock near the cairn. Strider suspected that it was a message from Gandalf that he was here on October 3rd, which was 3 days ago, and that he was in danger. That night the group were attacked on Weathertop by the Black Riders. Frodo felt himself compelled to slip on the ring, and he saw the terrible figures beneath their black wrappings. As one of the figures approached Frodo, this happened. At that moment Frodo threw himself on the ground, and he heard himself crying aloud, "O Elbereth Githoniel!" At the same time he struck at the feet of the enemy. A shrill cry rang out in the night, and he felt a pain like a dart of poisoned ice pierce his left shoulder. Even as he swooned he caught, as through a swirling mist, a glimpse of Strider leaping out of the darkness with a flaming brand of wood in either hand. With a last effort, Frodo, dropping his sword, slipped the ring from his finger and closed his right hand tight upon it. So as we finish this chapter, and the end of Frodo's second week out of Hobbiton, here's a map showing his current progress through the Lonelands, with yesterday's progress in red and today's in yellow. And that's it for chapter 3 of Frodo's journey. Next time we'll be following his progress towards Rivendell. If you enjoyed this video, please do me a big favour and subscribe to my channel by hitting the G rune showing here. And that will keep me topped up with motivation and encouragement to continue the journey, which I hope one day will reach Mordor and Mount Doom. Until next time, thanks for watching.